Welcome back, everybody, to Seder Sugyot, Seder Night Sugyot. We are at our last week. Very exciting. Excited to see you all here tonight, and happy. Hopefully, you'll all come join us at the Siyum next week. The Siyum from Masechet Pesachim. Whether or not you finish the Daf Yomi or you're not finishing the Pesachim in the Daf Yomi, you're still invited to the Siyum. The idea is a celebration of all learning. I want you all to be excited that you finished this 10-week course, which is amazing. We will talk more at the end about kind of bringing it all together. Specifically, today's class is dedicated in memory of Alvin E. Gershwin, Avraham Yitzchak ben Chaim Shmuel Zichrono Livracha, by his daughter and granddaughter Ruth Gershon and Tamar Gold. Nothing would have made him happier than seeing his daughter and granddaughter learning together within the framework of women's education in Israel. Thank you for the dedication. So just again, a reminder, the Siyum is next Sunday, okay? The same time as it is now, which now that the clocks have changed in America, the time is now 2:30 Eastern time, and everyone can calculate based on that. It'll be 8:30 Israel time. At the Siyum, we're not only having speakers from the world of women's learning, but we also are having speakers, one from women learners from the Daf Yomi and one woman from our class, Professor Susan Handelman. We're honored that she's going to be giving a number of words of insights from the course. So please join the Siyum next week. And the final thing I want to say is that I'm going to prepare a package of materials that hopefully will go up next week on the course website of a summary of the things that we learned, with a little short video going through some of the methodologies that we've learned throughout the course, and some words, terms, things like that. So there'll be some sheets and there'll be a short video. So make sure we'll send out a link when it's ready. Make sure to go and to look at that just as a good sum up of the whole class. Okay, we're intro into today's class. So what we've done so far today, our topic is going to be matzah and maror, which we've mentioned a bunch of times already throughout. We've seen them in different places. We started with, do we recline for them? Back to the beginning. Okay, it's a good topic because it kind of reviews a bunch of things we did. Remember, we talked about, well, the maror is based on, it's for the slavery, it's representative of the struggling. So of course we don't recline, whereas the matzah is a symbol of freedom, we do recline. The problem with the matzah is a little tricky because the matzah has the aspect of freedom as symbolizing they got out of Egypt and they had to rush when they got their freedom. On the other hand, it also has this aspect of lechem oni, which is poor man's bread. And it reminds us a little bit of the afflictions that they had in Egypt and how hard it was. They didn't really have a lot of bread. So matzah has a bit of those two elements to it. Despite that, we still recline. But in any case, that we also talked last week, and one of the things we discussed, actually, let's go back a few weeks to the sandwich, the korech sandwich. Do we eat them together? And one of the things we said there was that the matzah and maror were supposed to be eaten together with the Pesach sacrifice. That was the original idea of the mitzvah. And we saw that there was a debate about whether, we actually saw that maror nowadays is d'Rabbana and matzah is d'oraita. D'Rabbana means it's rabbinic. Matzah is Torah obligation. And that's why we had this whole discussion. Are mitzvot mevatlot zo et zo? Do they nullify each other? In which case, if they're different levels, the same levels, we had all these discussions about that. That was premised on what we're going to learn in today's class, which is, I know some people ask them, well, how do we know that matzah is Torah? How do we know that maror is rabbinic? And the other thing we're going to learn today is it's not actually so clear cut. Not everybody agrees that matzah nowadays is Torah law and maror is rabbinic. So today's discussion is going to be, what is the status of eating matzah and maror nowadays? Now that we no longer have a sacrifice, if the original mitzvah was to eat it together with the Pesach sacrifice, the matzah and the maror, the question is, what is the status of this mitzvah once there's no longer a temple and we no longer bring a sacrifice? So that's the main issue that we're going to discuss today. Before I send you off, I'll just review another thing that we did last week, because it's a good at the end kind of summarize a bunch of things, and especially the topics that have to do with tonight, which is we saw about the afikomen. And if you remember, there were a few opinions about the afikomen. Why do we eat matzah at the end of the Seder? So we saw the Rashbam, which was an interesting approach, which went somewhat different from what we normally think, which is that he claims the matzah b'afikomen is the matzah of the mitzvah. The matzah you eat when you say the bracha al achilat matzah is actually not the real matzah. And the matzah that you eat at the end of the Seder that's really fulfilling your obligation. We saw another opinion, which is really the main mitzvah is earlier. However, in order to remember the Pesach sacrifice, remember that matzah was eaten with the Pesach sacrifice in the time of the temple. So we eat it at the end of the meal because that's when they did it in the time of the temple. Because if you remember, the whole idea is you're supposed to eat the meat al hasova when you're satiated. So they would do it at the end. So therefore, one opinion is to say, well, it's to remember. It's not the real mitzvah, but it is a mitzvah of remembering the Pesach sacrifice. The last opinion we saw was that it's actually not a mitzvah. It's just and it's not even just a way of remembering the Pesach Seder, but we want the matzah taste to linger in our mouths. So because we want it to linger in our mouths, we eat matzah again at the end. As we've already fulfilled our mitzvah before, if you want to remember the temple, well, we did that in the korech sandwich. You don't need the afikomen for that. So that opinion says the afikomen is really just to keep this matzah taste in your mouth. So again, that all assumes that there's an obligation to eat matzah, even when there's no Pesach, right? There's no Pesach sacrifice. So today we're going to see where that all comes from. Okay, the intros that you need, the basics of concepts that you need for today and methodological points is the last. I'm going to tell you 3 more things and then we'll go into Chavruta. First of all, today's sugya is a little bit easier. Okay, we're learning on daf kuf chaf. We're starting where we finished last time, and we're going to get to the Mishnah on the page. So that's first of all. We're going to now talk about 3 concepts. One is this word called a phrase, and it works together with, it goes with a few words, and then there's an end word, and then the in between kind of depends on what's going on. So it's the words are salka data chamina, which is you would have thought to say. Salka means to go up, like you could climb up a ladder, salka. You could go up, it comes up in the Gemara, people who went to Israel, they go up to Israel, like we talk about aliyah. So salka, but it also comes up many, many times in this phrase, salka data chamina, which is you would have thought, and amina means to say, okay, salka ole al da'atchai might occur to you to say. And then in between is what you might have thought to say, and it ends with ka mashmalan, and often it's written with abbreviations, kuf mem lamed, which means, we had this last week, which means, therefore, it comes to teach you that that's not the case. Okay, today where it's going to be, there's a verse in the Torah that if you wouldn't have this verse, you would have thought something. Comes the verse to teach you, right? Like I could say ka mashmalan, in other words, comes the verse to teach you that that's not the case. Okay, so what you might have thought is not the case. The second thing I want to teach you is what a tzriche is. Tzriche literally means I need, okay? I need it, or it's needed. And what does it mean? It means that sometimes we think we could learn something from one verse, and then it turns out it seems to appear in another verse, the same thing. And then the question is, why do we need both to tell us the same law? And then they go into a tzriche. Usually the Gemara explains why you need both, because if you have one, you'd only think this, and if you had that one, you wouldn't have been able to learn from the other. And therefore we need them both. In this case, we're going to have a tzricha in the Gemara without an explanation. The Rashbam is going to explain exactly what the tzricha is all about and why you need both. The Gemara just says it simply as if you understand why you need them both. But in this case, the Rashbam is going to kind of play the role of the Gemara. And the last thing is that we're going to have today 2 different opinions, basically. That's the structure. And then we're going to have a ping pong, what I call it, between the 2 of them, which is one's going to say, well, I use this as my proof, this verse. And then the other is going to say, oh no, I use that verse to teach me this. And therefore, where do I need to derive it from? Oh, I derive it from a different verse. And I have a different halacha. And then they ping pong back and each one has to explain, well, if they don't think that verse teaches what the other person thinks, what do they do with that verse? And that's a lot of what we're going to have today. So with that, we'll get started with Chavruta. I'm actually going to give you 20 minutes right now because I want you to kind of master the Chavruta. I think that you can probably, many of you will be able to get through everything. If you manage to get through everything and you still have time, you can always go back and talk more and discuss. So I thought for the last class, we'd try to give you a little bit of extra Chavruta time. So we're going to start with 20 minutes and you can get started now.